On September 23, 1950, Irene Moore Lyon, the wealthy daughter and heiress to the Pennsylvania Coke dynasty magnate John William Moore, died at the age of 68. Her estate, the product of a fortune carved during a period of massive railroad expansion, immediately became the center of a dispute. This was not just a wealthy woman's probate case. Within days of her death, two names surfaced. One name the court expected, Elizabeth Betsy Lyon, hereinafter called Betsy, and her father, Dr. James Lyon, who it turns out had been written out of the will. His inheritance was gone. Hers was reduced significantly. There was another name that no one had ever heard before, Foster Flint, a name that sounds modern today. In the 1900s, it followed him everywhere he went, and not always kindly. If someone saw Betsy and Foster's names printed beside each other on paper, the immediate reaction would be confusion. Different towns, different families, different last names, no obvious overlap, no reason to believe they were connected. Yet the truth lived beneath the surface, always there, just never acknowledged. I have now mentioned 5 of the key figures in this series, and it is helpful to know that across this 10-episode story, I've endeavored to keep our cast of characters tight. To reiterate, the first 5 central figures are these: John William Moore, father of Irene Moore Lyon, the heiress, whose passing and contested trust sit at the center of the story. Dr. James Lyon, a prominent Washington, D.C. heart surgeon who played football at Syracuse. Betsy Moore, the beautiful headline-driving daughter of James Lyon and Irene Moore Lyon. Betsy was adopted in her early 40s, at the height of the couple's social prestige. Dr. Foster Flint, Ph.D., the genetic child of Dr. James Lyon, M.D., who in his early 40s believed he may have a legal right to a portion of the contested estate. The remaining important figures will appear naturally as the story progresses, not all at once, but each with significance. Auntie Ruth Stoughton, William Stoughton, farmer, Mary Stoughton, William's spouse and parent to 9 children, including Ruth. Dr. Omar Alpha Flint. Yes, Alpha truly was his middle name. Mary Jane Flint. Theodore Deutsch, Betsy's first husband. Harry Kelly, Betsy's second husband. And Michael Colaboletta, Betsy's third husband. Several disputes came forward via legal documents that impacted every one of the aforementioned. The initial part of the journey, the one that takes us so much further than we could have ever imagined, leans into Irene Moore Lyon's sequence of actions. First, Irene Moore Lyon changed her will very late in life, and the change was done in secrecy. Second, her husband at the time, Dr. James Lyon, was removed from the will entirely. Third, her adopted daughter, Betsy, in the updated will, was left a comparatively small inheritance, with generational skipping provisions added for good measure. A structure was designed to bypass her entirely in favor of later generations via external trustees. Through this story, we are not here to determine who was right or wrong. I am not here to cast judgment. I will tell the story through documented realities, through timelines, court filings, letters, newspaper archives, family accounts, genealogical confirmations, AI, and historical context. My intent is for listeners to come to their own conclusions. What Dr. Foster Flint did not know was that his biological father, Dr. James Lyon, had been written out of the will, and Foster was only beginning to understand that he too might have a role in the estate. He was unknowingly standing opposite his adopted half-sister in the line of inheritance. How does someone learn at 40 years of age that their identity, their origin, was kept secret for a lifetime? Neither Foster nor Betsy understood what lay ahead. They did not know how they would react when the truth arrived, or how lawyers and courtroom decisions would come to define the rest of their lives. 12 strangers would decide their fate, a jury of 6 men and 6 women. Some would emerge better off, others would see little change, and some would pay a far higher price. This is the moment the story shifts. This is where it becomes something else entirely. It becomes generational storytelling at its best and worst. There are answers to so many of the obvious questions. There are dates, documents, legal letters, birth certificates, wills, amendments, adoption records, marriage records, and newspaper accounts. And there are gaps, missing fragments where history is less clear. When details are incomplete, I will acknowledge them openly and avoid speculation unless the logic of the era strongly supports a conclusion. Here is what I do know. I am of sound health, mind, and body. Some people connected to this history may rather these stories not be told, but the truth still matters to me. I approach this as neutral as Switzerland, objective, factual, as fair as I can possibly be. And to that extent, if additional information comes forward, if new letters are available, if people would like to share memories, if different family accounts are available, I would love to hear them and would gladly incorporate them into additional episodes. Let me also say this clearly. I have no intention of self-harm. Finally, let me add one more important disclaimer as we dive deeper. We must resist the temptation to judge the decisions of the past by the standards of today. This is not a story of the early 2000s, but rather one of the early to mid-1900s. Society was different. Privacy was different. Power and influence moved differently. Social media did not exist. Protecting reputation was everything. The purpose of this podcast is not to provoke outrage or shock, though disbelief is almost inevitable. The goal is understanding, heritage, lineage, truth, when we are willing to open our eyes and confront it. Back to our story. During courtroom proceedings, attorneys examined Irene Moore Lyon's final will, then her earlier will, then the circumstances and timing of the revision. From a legal standpoint, the essential question was simple. Which version reflected Irene's truest intent, and whether she was of sound mind? From Dr. Lyon's perspective, the stakes were massive. He had been removed at the last moment. Could that be undone? From Foster's perspective, the case represented a new belonging, a new identity, a connection, and the possibility of financial security. From Betsy's perspective, life as she knew it had been rewritten. Everything her mother had taught her to expect about her future was suddenly erased. The will now provided for her softly and had all the mechanisms in place to skip her legally and symbolically. While the court examined documents, Dr. Lyon maneuvered behind the scenes, positioning himself and weighing how to protect his legacy. Which path might unlock the estate for him? If you explore records on the City of Rockville, Maryland website, you will find reference to Glenview Mansion. Irene Moore purchased the land in 1917 before she married Dr. Lyon. On June 9, 1923, she married Dr. James Lyon. That same year, they commissioned architects Lockheed and Porter to transform Glenview from a farm into an elegant country estate built for entertaining. It quickly became a hub for Washington's social elite. In 1926, they adopted Betsy, the only child to come from their marriage. On the grounds sits a playhouse built in 1936 for Betsy. It's known today as the Civic Center Cottage. It contains bunk beds, a sunroom, a stone fireplace, and wooden gables. A playhouse so grand that it symbolized love, privilege, and expectation. A place where a daughter might feel secure in her father's affection, where future suitors would compete with a standard no man could meet. A love so deep that future husbands would go to great lengths and yet find themselves locked outside the fortress of the bond a father and daughter shared. No one, not lawyers, nor jurors, nor reporters scribbling notes into their pads, understood that the claimants shared more than a legal dispute. They shared an estate. They shared histories, and though one knew and the other had no idea, they also shared extended family. Connections that only legal documents and letters from Auntie Ruth would be able to shed light upon years later. Items that came to light right before the court battle, likely in a tip of the cap to the Gatsby lifestyle that Irene and Dr. Lyon led. The F. Scott Fitzgerald Theater for the Performing Arts now stands adjacent to the Glenview property, also known as the Lyon Estate at one time. The front door of the mansion faces the facility. It sits less than a quarter mile away. The Glenview Mansion and the F. Scott Fitzgerald Theater brought to mind a great book for obvious reasons. The Great Gatsby, written by F. Scott Fitzgerald, drew a line across the water. East Egg and West Egg, two worlds separated by a strip of shimmering possibility. In Gatsby's world, one shore represented old wealth, established, inherited, unquestioned. The other new ambition, bright lights sitting close enough to see, and yet far enough to ache for. In Rockville, those two landmarks trace a similar characteristic when juxtaposed. Glenview Mansion, the historic estate stately rooted in another era, feels like East Egg, solid, old world, marble, and memory. Just down the hill sits the F. Scott Fitzgerald Theater, humming with sound checks and spotlights, a place where new stories are told and new voices work to be heard. That is West Egg, forward-leaning, aspiring, a stage for the future. Between them lies the same invisible tension Fitzgerald wrote about for generations, legacy on one side, reinvention on the other, two places tied to the same ground, yet reflecting different chapters of what we call the American dream. However, before we move forward to explore, we get to step back and determine, where did the money originate? What scenario and risk created a fortune large enough to divide generations later? That story begins in the next episode when we discuss how the empire was established.